In September 1683, the gates of Vienna stood under the looming threat of one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. The Ottoman Empire, advancing with tens of thousands of soldiers, sought to expand its reach into Central Europe. Against overwhelming odds, a coalition of European forces, led by the legendary Polish King John III Sobieski, marched to defend the city. This is the story of courage, strategy, and heroism, where the fate of a continent hung in the balance, and the walls of Vienna became the stage for an epic showdown. The summer of 1683 was marked by unease across Central Europe. Whispers of war spread faster than caravans, and merchants along the Danube spoke of a great host assembling under the banner of the Sultan. To many, it seemed like rumor exaggerated by fear. But soon, reports poured in. Villages abandoned, churches burned, and armies on the march. By June, there could be no doubt. The Ottoman Empire had set its sights on Vienna once more. Kara Mustafa Pasha's army was unlike any Europe had seen in a century. Numbering perhaps 150,000 soldiers, though chroniclers would later inflate the figure to nearly 300,000, the host was a vast and diverse force. Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, marched with the discipline of veterans. Sipahi cavalry, clad in glittering armor, rode alongside fierce Tatar horsemen from the steppes, their reputation for cruelty striking terror ahead of them. Siege engineers brought artillery, sappers, and wagons stacked with timber to build earthworks and trenches. The sheer size of the army slowed its march, but the purpose was clear. From Edirne through the Balkans, the army rolled like a tide, unstoppable in its advance. Cities that resisted were razed. Those that surrendered were spared but forced to supply men and provisions. By July, the Ottoman banners were seen near the borders of Austria. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburgs, was no ordinary city. It was a fortress surrounded by thick walls, bastions, and moats, yet inside, its defenses were stretched thin. Emperor Leopold I, fearing capture, abandoned the city on July 7th, fleeing west to Linz. Many nobles followed, leaving Vienna in the hands of a garrison of barely 15,000 soldiers and a citizen militia of around 5,000. Command of the defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a man of iron will. Only 36 years old, he faced a colossal task: hold out against the mightiest army in the world until help could arrive. Reinforcements from the Holy Roman Empire and Poland were promised, but no one knew if they would come in time. On July 14, 1683, the Ottoman vanguard appeared before Vienna. By July 17th, the city was surrounded, the crescent banners lined the hills, and the siege began in earnest. Ottoman tents stretched for miles, turning the plains into a city of silk and canvas. At its center stood the luxurious pavilion of Kara Mustafa himself, a palace of red and green, adorned with fountains and carpets, a striking contrast to the battered walls of Vienna. Kara Mustafa was confident. He believed Vienna would fall swiftly, not by storming its walls, but by starvation and fear. His army dug trenches and set up artillery, pounding the bastions day and night. Miners tunneled under the walls, planting explosives to shatter the defenses. Life in Vienna became a struggle for survival. Food grew scarce as weeks passed. Bread was rationed, and water from the Danube was cut off. Disease spread in the cramped quarters of the city, where civilians huddled in churches and cellars during bombardments. Yet morale under Starhemberg's command held firm. He inspired soldiers and civilians alike, declaring that Vienna would never surrender. Every time the Ottomans advanced, defenders sallied forth, burning siege works and harassing the sappers. Women and children carried stones, water, and ammunition to the ramparts, fighting side by side with soldiers. For nearly 2 months, the city endured. The Ottomans launched wave after wave of attacks, blasting holes in the walls only to be repelled by desperate defenders. On several occasions, mines detonated, sending towers and bastions crumbling. Yet every breach was filled with rubble, timber, and flesh, as the Viennese fought to plug the gaps. Kara Mustafa, however, grew frustrated. He refused to unleash his full army in a single storming of the city, fearing the immense casualties it would cost. Instead, he pressed the siege ever tighter, confident that starvation would break Vienna before any relief could arrive. But across Europe, the cry for help had been heard. And far to the north, a Polish king was already preparing to march. The thunder of Ottoman cannon echoed across the walls of Vienna, but the sound carried far beyond the city. Every explosion, every desperate dispatch that escaped the encircled fortress was a cry to Christendom, "Help us, or Europe will fall." For Emperor Leopold I, who had fled Vienna in haste, the stakes could not have been higher. If Vienna fell, the Habsburg heartlands lay open, and with them the Holy Roman Empire itself. From Linz and Passau, he sent desperate appeals to princes, dukes, and kings across Europe. At first, the response was lukewarm. Too often, Christendom had failed to unite against the Ottoman threat, consumed instead by its own rivalries. But in 1683, something was different. The first voice to answer Vienna's call was not a king or an emperor, but Pope Innocent XI. From Rome, the pontiff saw the siege not merely as a political struggle, but as a holy war. To him, the Ottoman advance was the gravest threat to Christendom since the fall of Constantinople. He proclaimed that the defense of Vienna was the defense of Europe itself, urging rulers to set aside their quarrels and form a new crusade. Through diplomacy, persuasion, and the promise of financial support, Innocent XI pushed for the creation of what would be called the Holy League. His greatest triumph was convincing the Polish king, John III Sobieski, to commit his armies to Vienna's salvation. Sobieski was no ordinary monarch. A veteran commander, he had already won fame for defeating Ottoman and Tatar forces at the Battle of Khotin in 1673. Known to his soldiers as a king who fought in the saddle beside them, Sobieski was a man both of chivalric presence and strategic brilliance. When the call for aid reached Poland, Sobieski did not hesitate. Though his nobles were cautious and many worried about leaving Poland vulnerable, Sobieski declared, "To save Vienna is to save Poland. If the enemy takes this city, they will take Krakow, then Warsaw. Better to meet them there than on our own soil." His decision changed the course of history. The Holy League was fragile, a coalition of necessity rather than unity. Alongside Sobieski's Polish army came contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia. The Holy Roman Empire, though fractured by its many states, pledged forces as well. Together they represented the patchwork of European Christendom, often divided, but now drawn together by the looming threat. The coordination was not easy. Old rivalries simmered, languages clashed, and commanders argued over precedence. Yet, under the pressure of time and the shadow of Vienna's imminent fall, the alliance held. By September 10th, Sobieski's army, numbering around 70,000 men, had crossed the Danube and climbed into the hills overlooking Vienna. His forces were exhausted after a brutal march, but their spirits soared as they looked down on the besieged city and the immense Ottoman camp sprawling across the plains. The stage was set. Vienna had held long enough. Now Europe's fate would be decided not by walls, but by open battle. At dawn on September 12, 1683, the hills surrounding Vienna stirred with life. The fields and forests that had, for 2 months, witnessed the relentless siege were now about to host something greater. The convergence of two colossal armies, one fighting for conquest, the other for survival. The air was thick with anticipation. In the valleys below, the crescent banners of the Ottoman Empire fluttered in the morning wind, their vast encampment sprawling like a second city. On the ridges above, the crosses of Christendom rose among the trees, where the relief army gathered to strike. The long night of siege was over. The day of battle had come. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had no doubt of his coming victory. His army was vast, perhaps 120,000 strong, with the hardened Janissaries at its core, supported by Sipahi cavalry, Tatar auxiliaries, and contingents from across the empire. Siege works already pressed against Vienna's battered walls. The defenders were at their breaking point. When news reached him that a Christian relief force had arrived, he was unshaken. He believed his army could both contain Vienna and repel the newcomers. His strategy was to hold the high ground near the city and grind down his enemies in a battle of attrition. But his confidence blinded him. He underestimated both the determination of Vienna's defenders and the ferocity of the Polish king marching to save them. High on the Kahlenberg Ridge, King John III Sobieski surveyed the scene. Below him, the plains stretched to the city walls, dominated by the Ottoman camp with its glittering tents and banners. To the west lay Vienna itself, scarred and smoking, its walls cratered but still standing. Sobieski knew that time was short. Each hour risked Vienna's fall, but he also knew the importance of patience. The Allied army, Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons and more, needed to be coordinated, their movements carefully timed. If they struck too hastily, the Ottomans could break them apart. That morning, Sobieski rallied his commanders. He reminded them that this was not merely a battle for Vienna, but for all of Christendom. His words were fiery and resolute. Today we fight not for crowns, nor for territories, but for our faith, our families, and the survival of Europe. The troops roared their approval, and the plan was set. The Allies would descend from the wooded hills, strike the Ottoman flanks, and push toward the city, while Sobieski himself prepared the greatest cavalry charge Europe had ever seen. The field of battle was treacherous. To the east, the Ottomans had entrenched themselves around Vienna, their trenches and siege lines forming barriers of earth and fire. To the north, thick woods covered the ridges, through which the Allied army had to march. The terrain favored defense, but Sobieski turned it to his advantage, concealing his movements until the moment of attack. The Allied forces stretched in a wide line, nearly 70,000 strong. On the left flank stood the imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine, pressing toward Vienna's northern defenses. In the center, German contingents advanced through the forests, clashing with Ottoman outposts. On the right flank, hidden among the hills, Sobieski massed his 20,000 Polish cavalry, waiting for the decisive strike. The Ottomans, meanwhile, surged out to meet them. The Janissaries, dressed in their tall white headgear, advanced with discipline, drums pounding and war cries echoing. Cavalry units wheeled across the plains, while Tatar horsemen darted like shadows along the flanks. By midday, the clash was in full fury. Cannon thundered from both sides, smoke rising in choking clouds over the battlefield. Muskets cracked in volleys, cutting down ranks of men, while swords and axes clashed in brutal melee. Vienna itself became part of the fight. From within the walls, Starhemberg ordered desperate sorties against the Ottoman siege lines, setting fire to trenches and distracting their foes. The defenders, though half-starved and wounded, fought as if possessed, knowing that salvation was at hand. The battle stretched into the afternoon. The Allies pressed slowly but steadily, driving the Ottomans back from the ridges. Kara Mustafa, realizing the danger, threw more troops into the fray, determined to hold his ground. But each wave of resistance was met with greater ferocity. The moment of decision was drawing near. As the sun began to sink, Sobieski saw his chance. The Ottoman lines, stretched and battered from hours of fighting, had begun to waver. The Janissaries still held firm near the city, but the flanks were collapsing under pressure. He turned to his Polish hussars, the legendary winged cavalry, their armor gleaming, great feathered wings rising from their saddles. Behind them, ranks of heavy cavalry from across Europe readied for the final charge. Sobieski lifted his sword and gave the order. The world would soon witness a charge that would echo through history. The battlefield trembled with the weight of tens of thousands of men locked in struggle. But as the sun dipped low on September 12, 1683, a new sound began to rise above the clash of steel and the thunder of cannon. It was not the roar of battle, but the pounding of hooves. On the slopes of the Kahlenberg Hill, hidden until the very last moment, the greatest cavalry force in Europe prepared to descend upon the enemy. At their head was King John III Sobieski, the Lion of Poland, his eyes fixed on the Ottoman camp sprawling across the plains below. The time had come for the strike that would decide the fate of Vienna, and perhaps of Europe itself. Nearly 20,000 horsemen stood ready, Polish hussars, German cuirassiers, and other mounted contingents of the Holy League. But it was the hussars who captured every gaze. They were no ordinary cavalry. Clad in gleaming armor, with long lances poised and sabers at their sides, the hussars were a sight both terrible and magnificent. Their most striking feature were the great wooden frames rising from their backs, fitted with eagle feathers that arched like wings. In the wind, They rattled with a ghostly hiss, a sound that terrified both men and horses. To friend and foe alike, they seemed less like soldiers and more like warriors descended from the heavens. Sobieski himself took command of the right flank, placing himself at the tip of the spear. Few kings in history would have dared such a charge, but Sobieski was not a king content to watch from a distance. The battlefield had reached its breaking point. The Allied infantry pressed hard on the Ottoman lines, pushing them back toward their camp. But victory was not yet assured. The Janissaries still fought ferociously near the city walls, their discipline holding even as the tide turned against them. Sobieski knew that one decisive blow was needed to shatter the enemy's will. He turned to his men, raised his sword and shouted, "In the name of God and the Blessed Virgin, charge for Vienna, charge for Poland, charge for Christendom." The trumpets sounded. The earth shook. The charge began. The thunder of hooves echoed across the valley as the cavalry surged forward. Dust rose in great clouds, sunlight flashing off armor and lances as the horde of horsemen gained speed. From the ridges of the Kahlenberg, they poured down in waves, unstoppable and furious. At their head, Sobieski spurred his horse to full gallop, his standard raised high. Around him, the hussars leveled their lances, their wings whistling through the air. The Ottomans looked up in shock. For hours they had battled the infantry, never expecting a cavalry strike of such magnitude. Kara Mustafa's soldiers tried to form defensive lines, but it was too late. When the hussars crashed into them, it was like a thunderbolt from the sky. The sheer weight and momentum of the charge smashed through the Ottoman ranks. Lines of Sipahi cavalry buckled under the impact, scattered like leaves in the storm. Infantry formations crumbled, their ranks torn apart by lance and saber. The hussars drove deep into the heart of the Ottoman camp, their ferocity unmatched. Allied cavalry followed, exploiting the breach. German and Austrian horsemen swept into the fray, cutting down enemies and driving them into panic. The Ottoman lines, so confident that morning, dissolved into chaos. Sobieski and his hussars cut straight toward Kara Mustafa's command post. The Grand Vizier fled in haste, his army collapsing around him. What had begun as a siege of triumph ended in a rout. From the city walls, the defenders of Vienna watched in awe. They saw the winged horsemen storming through the Ottoman camp, the enemy scattering in terror. Cheers erupted from the battered garrison as the truth became clear. Vienna had been saved. As dusk fell, the once mighty Ottoman army was in full retreat, abandoning their cannons, tents and supplies in a desperate flight eastward. Kara Mustafa's grand gamble had failed. The gateway to Europe remained closed, and at its heart stood the charge of the Hussars, the largest and most decisive cavalry assault in European history. As the sun dipped low over the Viennese plains, the battlefield had been transformed from a scene of brutal clash into a theater of chaos. The once mighty Ottoman army, disciplined and formidable, now faltered under the relentless pressure of Sobieski's allied forces. Where hours before the Janissaries had stood firm, rows of fleeing soldiers now tore through the camp, abandoning tents, cannons and supplies. The streets of Vienna and the surrounding fields echoed with the pounding of hooves and the cries of both victors and vanquished. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had fled in disarray, his command structure in ruins. Messages failed to reach units, orders went unheeded, and panic spread faster than the Allied charge. Soldiers who had fought with unshakable discipline now turned their weapons on one another, desperate to escape the carnage. From the hills, Sobieski's forces pursued without mercy. Every road, every river crossing, became a gauntlet for the retreating Ottoman soldiers. The Allies pressed relentlessly, cutting off stragglers and capturing artillery. What had begun as a siege ended as a complete rout, one that would echo through history as a turning point for Europe. The Ottoman cavalry, which had once swept across Europe like a storm, was shattered. Sipahi horsemen galloped aimlessly across the plains, their discipline broken by the overwhelming assault. Infantry units, deprived of leadership, attempted to regroup but were met with cavalry charges that splintered them within minutes. Tatar auxiliaries and mercenaries tried to hold rear positions, but even these efforts could not stem the tide. Vienna's defenders emerged from the city walls to aid the Allies, striking at isolated Ottoman remnants and driving them further east. The success of the rout was no accident. King Sobieski's strategy combined patience, deception, and precision. By holding his cavalry in reserve until the decisive moment, he avoided unnecessary losses and struck with maximum impact. His coordination with imperial commanders ensured that the Ottoman army had nowhere to regroup, turning retreat into catastrophe. Even as the Ottomans fled, Sobieski maintained discipline among his troops. Looting was kept to a minimum. The focus remained on pursuit and neutralization. This control ensured that the victory would be complete, leaving no opportunity for the enemy to recover. Despite the triumph, the battlefield was littered with the fallen. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead or wounded, while Allied casualties, though smaller, were a stark reminder of the battle's ferocity. Vienna had been saved, but the price had been steep. For the citizens of Vienna, the rout meant survival. For Europe, it marked the halting of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The victory restored faith and morale across Christian states, signaling that even the greatest empires could be challenged with courage, strategy, and unity. As night fell over the plains, the Allies gathered to tend the wounded, recover the dead, and secure the spoils of war. Sobieski's leadership became legend. The Polish Hussars' charge was immortalized in memory and art. The Ottoman retreat stretched for miles, leaving behind the scars of defeat and the inevitability of history's judgment. The Siege of Vienna had ended, but the reverberations of the battle would echo for decades. Empires shifted, alliances strengthened, and the course of Europe had changed forever, all because of the courage of those who stood against the tide at Vienna. The city of Vienna, once trembling under the shadow of the Ottoman siege, now breathed a sigh of relief. The streets, once scarred by the march of enemy troops and the pounding of siege cannons, were filled with the victorious cries of soldiers and citizens alike. Joy and gratitude mingled with exhaustion as the defenders and allies celebrated the salvation of the city. King John III Sobieski, the Lion of Poland, rode through the streets of Vienna amidst cheering crowds. Soldiers of the Holy League marched in formation, their banners fluttering in the breeze, while citizens showered them with flowers and blessings. Church bells rang across the city, calling the faithful to give thanks for the miraculous victory. For the people of Vienna, the celebration was more than relief. It was a moment of survival against seemingly insurmountable odds. The Ottoman threat had been vanquished, and the city's walls, though scarred, still stood as symbols of resilience. The Polish Hussars were at the heart of the celebrations. Tales of their fearless charge from Kahlenberg Hill spread quickly, turning them into legendary figures. Sobieski himself received accolades not only as a brilliant commander, but also as a symbol of Christian unity against the Ottoman advance. Allied leaders were recognized for their coordination and bravery, cementing diplomatic ties that would shape the balance of power in Europe. Feasts were held, prayers were offered, and medals were distributed. Acts that honored the courage and sacrifice of those who had fought in the siege. Amidst the celebrations, the work of rebuilding began. The city's fortifications had suffered under the bombardment. Homes had been damaged or destroyed, and the economy disrupted by months of warfare. Skilled artisans, laborers, and soldiers turned their hands to repair walls, bridges, and infrastructure, ensuring that Vienna could continue to thrive. Merchants returned to the markets, bringing goods from across Europe, while farmers repaired fields and tended livestock that had survived the siege. Churches and civic buildings were restored, and memorials were erected to commemorate the bravery of both the defenders and the allies who had saved the city. The victory at Vienna strengthened alliances across Christian Europe. The Holy League, composed of Polish, Austrian, and German forces, had proven that unity could halt the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Diplomats and monarchs exchanged messages of solidarity, and the battle became a rallying point for collective defense against future threats. Sobieski's leadership inspired not only Poland, but the entire continent. Europe had witnessed how courage, strategy, and cooperation could overcome overwhelming odds, a lesson that would resonate for generations. For ordinary citizens and soldiers alike, the memories of the siege were vivid and haunting. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and narrow escapes were shared in taverns, homes, and churches. These recollections ensured that the legacy of the battle would live on not only in official histories, but also in the hearts of those who had endured it. Though the city celebrated, there was a somber awareness of the cost of victory. The dead and wounded were honored, their names remembered in prayers and memorials. The lessons of resilience, courage, and unity would shape Vienna's future, ensuring that the city would stand strong against whatever challenges lay ahead. By the time winter arrived, Vienna had regained much of its vitality. Fortifications were repaired, alliances strengthened, and the memory of the siege became a symbol of hope and determination. Europe looked on, inspired by the courage of those who had defended the city and by the decisive leadership of King Sobieski. The celebration and rebuilding of Vienna were not merely acts of restoration, they were the birth of a renewed Europe, one capable of resisting threats and protecting its people. The victory at Vienna had secured not only a city, but a continent's future. The echoes of the Battle of Vienna resonated far beyond the city walls. What had begun as a desperate defense against the Ottoman siege became a turning point in European history, shaping diplomacy, warfare, and the balance of power for decades to come. The legacy of the battle was felt not only in politics and military strategy, but also in culture, art, and the collective memory of Europe.